The gravel crunched under Martha's worn boots as she stepped onto her front porch that Tuesday morning. Coffee mugs steaming in the crisp Montana air. 3 motorcycles lay twisted in her driveway like broken metal bones, their riders sprawled unconscious in pools of blood. Most 73-year-old women would have called 911 immediately. Martha set down her coffee and walked to her barn instead. Inside, beneath dusty hay bales and rusted farm tools, lay a steel case that hadn't been opened in 20 years. Her arthritic fingers moved with surprising precision across the combination lock. The lid creaked open, revealing pristine medical instruments, military-grade first aid supplies, and a leather holster containing a Glock 19, all relics from her previous life as a battlefield medic in 3 undisclosed conflicts. The beaten bikers stirred as Martha worked, their eyes widening when they saw their elderly savior stitching wounds with surgeon-like expertise. But what they couldn't see were the black SUVs already turning down her mile-long driveway, carrying the men who'd left them for dead. Men who had no idea they were about to face a legend they thought was buried forever. But what drove Martha to abandon her peaceful retirement and risk everything for 3 strangers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Martha's hands moved without hesitation as she knelt beside the first biker, a massive man with graying temples whose leather vest bore the insignia of the Iron Wolves MC. Blood seeped from a gash across his scalp, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. She'd seen worse, much worse, in the field hospitals of places that didn't exist on any official maps. "Easy there, soldier," she murmured, cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency. The man's eyes fluttered open, confusion replacing pain as he focused on her weathered face. Who are you?" he wheezed. "Someone who knows what it looks like when men are left to die," Martha replied, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there during her morning coffee. She moved to the second biker, younger, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. "What's your name?" "Tank," the older man managed. "That's Rico, and the kid's called Mouse." Mouse couldn't have been more than 25, blood matting his blonde hair where someone had worked him over with something heavier than fists. Martha's jaw tightened as she assessed the damage. This wasn't a random beating. This was methodical, professional. Someone had wanted information. The rumble of engines in the distance made her pause. She'd been expecting this. In her experience, men who left others for dead rarely stayed gone for long. They came back to clean up loose ends. "Can any of you move?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Tank tried to sit up and immediately collapsed back against the gravel. "They took our phones, said they'd be back to finish the job after they handled some business." Martha stood, brushing dirt from her knees. 23 years of retirement had made her soft around the edges, but muscle memory was a powerful thing. She walked back into the barn and emerged with a hunting rifle that looked well-maintained despite its age. "Ma'am, you need to get inside and call the police," Tank said, alarm cutting through his pain. "These aren't ordinary men. They're cartel. We stumbled onto something we shouldn't have, and now they're coming to tie up loose ends," Martha finished. She checked the rifle's action with movements that spoke of decades of familiarity. "The nearest sheriff station is 40 minutes away. These gentlemen will be here in 3. The black SUVs crested the hill at the end of her driveway, moving fast but not recklessly. Professional. Just like she'd expected. Martha had chosen this property for its isolation, its defensible position, and the clear sightlines it provided. What she hadn't expected was to ever need those advantages again. She'd hung up her weapons alongside her grief 20 years ago, when the last of her causes had ended and the last of her friends had died. She'd come to Montana to tend flowers and forget the weight of lives in her hands. But watching 3 young men bleeding in her driveway, She remembered something her first commanding officer had told her in a field hospital outside Kandahar. "You can retire from the war, Thompson, but the war never retires from you." The SUVs slowed as they approached the motorcycles, and Martha could see figures moving inside. She counted at least 6 men, probably more. They'd come prepared for wounded bikers, not for a 73-year-old woman who'd once held a perimeter against 30 insurgents while evacuating a medical unit. "Ma'am," Rico spoke for the first time, his voice tight with pain and fear. "Please, just hide. We got ourselves into this mess." Martha looked down at him, seeing not a biker, but a scared young man who reminded her of 100 soldiers she'd patched up and sent back into hell. She'd sworn she was done saving people, done fighting other people's wars. The lead SUV stopped 50 yards from the house. Martha chambered around. Some oaths, it seemed, were harder to break than others. The 3 men who had beaten the bikers were already 2 miles down the dirt road when Martha finished checking pulses. 2 of the injured were unconscious, but breathing steadily. The third, a man with graying temples and a leather vest declaring him road captain, managed to focus his swollen eyes on her face. "Lady," he wheezed through split lips, "you need to get out of here. They'll be back." Martha wiped blood from a cut above his eyebrow with surprising gentleness. "What's your name?" Jake Morrison." He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, clutching his ribs. "Those bastards took our bikes, our patches. They're not done with us." "Who were they?" Jake's laugh turned into a cough that brought up specks of blood. "Wolves, MC. Been trying to muscle in on our territory for months. Finally decided to make their point." Martha nodded, filing away the information with the same methodical precision she'd once used to catalogue enemy assets in Beirut. "Can you walk?" "Don't think so. My legs—" Jake looked down at his left knee, which was bent at an angle that defied anatomy. "I'm going to move you and your friends into my house. Then I'm going to make some calls." "No cops," Jake said quickly. "This is club business." Martha's smile held no warmth. "I wasn't planning to call the police." It took her 40 minutes to get all 3 men inside using an old wheelbarrow from the barn and a stubborn determination that surprised even her. Jake remained conscious throughout, gritting his teeth as she maneuvered him onto her living room couch. The other 2, younger men she learned were called Diesel and Crow, she arranged on air mattresses dragged down from the attic. While they rested, Martha moved through her house with purpose. From a false bottom in her bedroom dresser, she retrieved a satellite phone that hadn't been used in 8 years. From behind a loose board in the basement, she pulled out a waterproof case containing 3 passports, each with her photograph, but different names. And, from a hidden compartment in her kitchen pantry, she took out something she'd hoped never to touch again. A Glock 19 that had traveled with her from Prague to Damascus to Caracas. Always cleaned, always ready. The weight of the weapon felt familiar in her hands, muscle memory overriding 8 years of peaceful retirement. She checked the magazine, still full, and chambered around with a practiced motion that would have shocked anyone who knew her only as the woman who brought apple pies to church socials. The satellite phone came to life on the 3rd attempt. The number she dialed was burned into her memory, though she'd never expected to use it again. Control. The voice that answered was crisp, professional, ageless. "This is Nightingale," Martha said, using a call sign that had been retired with her. "I need information." A pause. Nightingale was decommissioned. Nightingale was never decommissioned, just relocated. Martha looked out her kitchen window at the empty road. "I need everything you have on a motorcycle club called the Wolves, operating in rural Montana. Focus on current leadership and methods. This is highly irregular." "So is retirement." Martha's voice carried an edge that could cut glass. 12 hours or I start making inquiries through other channels." The line went dead. Martha pocketed the phone and returned to check on her patients. Jake was awake, watching her with new interest. Something in her posture, perhaps, or the way she'd handled the phone call with quiet authority. "You're not just some farm lady, are you?" he asked. Martha adjusted his blanket and checked his pupils for signs of concussion. "I'm exactly what I appear to be, a 73-year-old woman who likes her privacy. Lady, I've been around dangerous people my whole life. I know what it looks like." Jake's voice was stronger now, though still strained. "What did you do before you moved out here?" "I was a librarian. The lie came easily, polished by years of use. Now rest. You've lost blood, and you need sleep." But as she moved to the window to check the road again, Martha caught Jake's reflection in the glass. He was studying her with the calculating gaze of a man who'd learned to read people for survival, and she could see he wasn't buying her story for a second. Outside, dust clouds on the horizon suggested vehicles approaching fast. Martha counted 4 distinct trails, moving in formation rather than random traffic. She stepped back from the window and felt the familiar cold settling into her chest, the emotional shutdown that had kept her alive through 15 years of sanctioned violence. The wolves were coming back, and they were bringing friends. Martha checked her watch and did the math. The satellite intelligence wouldn't arrive for hours, but the enemy would be here in minutes. She'd have to rely on older skills, the ones that didn't require technological support, the ones that had never failed her yet. The first rule of survival Martha had learned 40 years ago was simple: never leave witnesses who could identify you. But as she stood over the 3 unconscious men zip-tied in her barn, that rule felt like it belonged to someone else's life. The Martha who had earned her reputation in Prague and Beirut would have already made her decision. The Martha who baked cookies for the church fundraiser hesitated. She checked their pulses again, all steady. The youngest one, barely out of his teens by the look of him, had a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck. Prison ink, crude but deliberate. The oldest bore scars that spoke of violence as a way of life, including what looked like an old bullet wound in his shoulder. The third man wore expensive boots beneath his leather chaps, the kind that suggested this wasn't about poverty or desperation. Martha pulled out the phones she'd taken from their pockets, scrolling through recent calls and messages. What she found made her blood run cold. Photos of her property taken from the road, her daily routine documented in text messages spanning 3 weeks. Her trips to town, her church schedule, even her Tuesday evening book club. Someone had been watching her. Someone who knew enough to send professionals. The messages referenced a package and the old location. One text thread mentioned payment for cleaning up loose ends and making sure the past stays buried. Martha's hands trembled as she read a message sent just hours before the attack, confirmed target. Proceed as discussed. No evidence. 43 years. She'd managed to stay hidden for 43 years, had built a life so ordinary it was invisible. She'd been Martha Collins, widow and retired librarian, for longer than she'd ever been Elena Vasquez, the ghost who had walked through locked doors in 36 countries. She moved to her workbench and opened a drawer she hadn't touched in over a decade. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a satellite phone. Her fingers remembered the weight of it, the specific sequence of numbers that would connect her to people who might no longer exist. The phone rang twice before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "This line is supposed to be dead." "Hello, Marcus." A long pause. "Jesus Christ. Elena? We buried you." Apparently not deep enough. Martha glanced at her captives. "I need information. Someone found me." "That's impossible. Your file was scrubbed. Even I don't officially know where you are." 3 men tried to kill me tonight. They'd been watching my property for weeks. Professional surveillance, Marcus. This wasn't random. She heard him typing in the background. Marcus Chen had been her handler during the final 5 years of her career, the only person in the agency who'd known about her growing desire to disappear entirely. He'd helped her fake her death in that warehouse fire in Moldova, had personally overseen the creation of Martha Collins. "Elena, listen to me carefully. There have been rumors, questions being asked about old operations. Someone's been digging through archived files, looking for connections to the Lazarus network. Martha's blood turned to ice. Lazarus had been the code name for her most classified missions, the ones that had never officially happened. Assassinations and extractions so sensitive that even the written records had been destroyed. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Those files were burned." Physical files, yes, but memories have a way of surfacing when the right pressure is applied. 3 months ago, Dmitry Kozlov was released from a Russian prison. You remember Dmitry? She did. Prague, 1981. Dmitry had been her target, but she'd been forced to abort when civilian casualties became inevitable. Instead, she'd fed information to the Czechs that landed him in prison. He'd sworn vengeance with his last free breath. "He's been very busy since his release," Marcus continued, paying for information, following paper trails. Apparently, he connected Elena Vasquez to a warehouse fire in Moldova and started asking why there was no body. Martha watched the youngest biker stir slightly. "How long do I have?" "If he sent these 3, he already knows where you are. When they don't report back, he'll send more, or come himself. Elena, you need to disappear. Tonight, I can have extraction." "No." Martha's voice was steel. "I'm tired of running, Marcus. Tired of looking over my shoulder. This is my home. This is suicide. You're 73 years old." Martha looked at her hands, still steady despite the years. At the barn, where she'd spent countless hours maintaining skills she'd hoped never to use again. At the 3 men who'd brought war to her doorstep. "Age is just a number," she said, and hung up. She walked to the youngest biker and slapped him awake. His eyes opened, unfocused and full of pain. "What's your name, son? Go to hell." Martha smiled, and for the first time in decades, it wasn't the gentle expression of a grandmother. It was the cold promise of Elena Vasquez. Wrong answer. The barn's interior seemed to breathe around Martha as she moved through familiar shadows. Her fingers found the hidden panel behind the workbench without conscious thought, muscle memory guiding her to secrets buried for decades. The wood slid away with a whisper, revealing a cavity that held more than tools and spare parts. Martha's hands closed around the cold steel of her. 45, a Colt 1911 that had saved her life in places whose names she'd sworn never to speak. The weight of it felt like coming home and stepping into hell simultaneously. Behind it, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay items she'd prayed would stay hidden forever. A Ka-Bar knife with a worn grip, several small devices that looked innocuous but could level a building, and a leather portfolio containing documents that officially didn't exist. She strapped the knife to her thigh beneath her dress, its familiar pressure both comforting and damning. The weight reminded her of who she used to be. Before Arthur, before the farm, before she'd convinced herself that Martha could bury Volkov completely. Outside, voices carried on the wind, professional voices, clipped and controlled. They weren't here for the bikers. Search pattern Alpha. Remember, the target is elderly, but consider her extremely dangerous. Martha's blood turned to ice water. They knew. Somehow, after 37 years of perfect cover, they knew. The bikers hadn't been random violence. They'd been a probe, a way to draw her out, and she'd taken the bait like an amateur. She moved to the barn's rear window and peered through warped glass. 6 figures in tactical gear spread across her property with military precision. Their weapons weren't standard law enforcement issue, and their movements spoke of extensive training. Private contractors, then, the kind of people who asked no questions and left no witnesses. The kitchen door exploded inward with a crash that echoed across the farm. Martha watched through the window as 2 figures swept into her home, weapons raised. They'd find nothing useful there. She'd learned long ago to keep her real life separate from her cover life. but it bought her precious minutes. Her radio crackled from the shelf. "Control, this is Team Leader. Package is not in primary structure. Initiating secondary sweep. Copy, Team Leader. Rules of engagement remain. Terminate on site. Authorization comes from the highest level." Martha closed her eyes. Highest level meant someone in the intelligence community had marked her for death. The question was whether this was about her past work or something new she'd stumbled into. Either way, running wasn't an option. Not at 73, not with her knees, and not against professionals who'd clearly done their homework. Which meant she had to become someone she'd promised Arthur she'd never be again. The transformation felt like shedding skin. Her posture straightened, her breathing slowed, and the tremor in her hands vanished completely. Martha Henley, retired widow and part-time quilter, stepped back into the shadows. In her place stood someone who'd once made grown men weep just by walking into a room. She activated the barn's secondary defenses, systems Arthur had helped her install but never questioned. The old generator hummed to life, powering equipment that created electronic dead zones and scrambled communications. Let them work blind for a while. Moving with practiced silence, she positioned herself near the barn's main entrance. The .45 felt steady in her grip, its weight distributed perfectly across hands that remembered exactly how to kill efficiently. The first one through the door would die before he knew she was there. The second might get off a shot, but it wouldn't matter. Footsteps approached, 2 sets, moving in tactical formation. She could tell from their rhythm that they were well-trained but not exceptional. Military backgrounds, probably special forces, but not the Tier 1 operators someone truly smart would have sent. Either her reputation had been exaggerated in their briefing, or whoever wanted her dead was underestimating what 3 decades of retirement had cost her. Their mistake. The barn door rattled. "Clear to breach," a voice whispered, barely audible. Martha pressed herself against the wall, finger caressing the trigger. The muscle memory was perfect, as if 37 years of peace had never happened. Her mind catalogued exit routes, weapon positions, and the 17 different ways she could kill both men with items within arm's reach. The door swung open. A rifle barrel appeared first, followed by a tactical helmet and body armor. Professional gear, but the man wearing it moved like someone who'd learned urban warfare, not the close-quarters brutality that had been Martha's specialty. She let him take 3 steps inside before she struck. The knife took him in the gap between his armor plates, angled upward to find his heart. He died with barely a sound. His partner spun toward the movement, but Martha was already moving, using the corpse as a shield while she put 2 rounds center mass into the second man. Blood spattered the hay bales where she'd once taught her grandchildren to play. The sweet smell of death mixed with the familiar sense of home, creating a contradiction that made her stomach turn. 4 more outside, and they'd heard the shots. The morning sun cast long shadows across Martha's property as she knelt beside the youngest biker, checking his pulse. Steady but weak. The other 2 were conscious now, watching her with a mixture of wariness and confusion as she moved between them with practiced efficiency. "Water!" the bearded one croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha nodded, disappearing into the house and returning with a pitcher and cups. She helped each man drink slowly, her weathered hands surprisingly gentle. The youngest, Tommy, she'd learned from their worried murmurs, stirred as cool water touched his lips. "Easy," she said softly. "You've got a concussion." The third biker, a lean man with graying temples, studied her with sharp eyes despite his injuries. "You're not what you seem, are you?" Martha met his gaze without flinching. "None of us are." Before he could respond, the distant rumble of engines echoed across the valley. Multiple motorcycles, growing closer. Martha's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her senses sharpening as she counted the sounds. 6 bikes, maybe 7. "That'll be Razor," the bearded biker said, relief flooding his voice. "Our president. Tell me about these people who did this to you," Martha said, her tone carrying an authority that made all three men focus despite their pain. The grey-haired biker, Jake, according to the others, struggled to sit up straighter. Called themselves the Serpents, showed up at our clubhouse 2 nights ago, said we were dealing on their territory. We weren't. We don't deal drugs, period. They wanted us to pay tribute, the bearded one added. When we refused, they said they'd make an example. Martha's jaw tightened. How many? Dozen, maybe more. They had military gear, moved like professionals. This wasn't some street gang turf war. The motorcycle engines were closer now, just beyond the tree line. Martha stood, brushing dirt from her knees as the convoy appeared on her dirt road. 7 Harleys in formation, their riders wearing leather cuts that marked them as the same club as the injured men. The lead rider was a mountain of a man with steel-grey hair and arms like tree trunks. He pulled up 20 feet from Martha's porch, his eyes taking in the scene, his injured brothers, the elderly woman standing calmly between them and potential threat. The other riders fanned out behind him, hands resting near weapons Martha was certain they carried. "I'm Razor," the big man said, removing his helmet. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "These are my brothers, Martha," she replied simply. "I found them on my property last night. They need medical attention." Razor's eyes narrowed as he took in the extent of the injuries, the makeshift bandages, the careful way Martha had positioned each man. "You do this?" "I helped them, nothing more." One of the other riders, a woman with short blonde hair and predatory eyes, leaned forward in her saddle. "Maybe we should ask what an old lady's doing alone out here, knowing how to patch up wounds like a field medic." Martha turned her attention to the woman, and something in her gaze made the rider's hand move instinctively toward her waist. "Maybe you should be more concerned about who put your friends in this condition." "Easy, Sarah," Razor said, dismounting. He approached slowly, hands visible, reading the tension in the air like a man accustomed to violence. "We appreciate what you've done for our brothers, but we need to know everything about what happened." Jake struggled to speak, his voice gaining strength. "Serpents hit us hard, Razor. Professional job. They're not done. Said they'd hunt down every member. Make examples of us all. They knew our roots," Tommy added weakly. "Our safe houses. Someone's feeding them information." Martha watched the exchange, noting how Razor's expression darkened with each detail. These weren't street thugs playing at being outlaws. They were organized, disciplined, and facing an enemy that outgunned and outmaneuvered them. "You have somewhere safe to take them?" she asked Razor. "Safe house about 40 miles north. But if these serpents are as connected as my boys say..." He left the sentence hanging. "They'll find you," Martha finished. "You need to disappear completely. Change your patterns, your communication methods, everything." Razor studied her with new interest. "You seem to know something about this kind of trouble." Martha was quiet for a long moment, watching as the other riders helped load the injured men onto the bikes. The youngest, Tommy, looked back at her with gratitude that made something twist in her chest. "I know about predators," she said finally, "and I know they don't stop until someone stops them. These aren't the kind of people you reason with," Razor said. "If you're thinking about getting involved..." "I'm not thinking about anything except making sure you get your boys proper medical care." Martha's voice was steady, but her eyes held depths that made the big biker step back. "But if these serpents come looking for you here, they won't find what they expect." The morning air carried the scent of pine and fresh earth as Martha stepped onto her porch, coffee mug in hand. The 3 bikers had been gone for 2 hours now, their motorcycles roaring to life before dawn and disappearing down the gravel road like fleeing ghosts. She'd watched from her kitchen window as they'd helped each other walk to their bikes, still favoring injuries but moving with the careful respect of men who'd learned something profound about underestimating others. Marcus Rodriguez would keep his word. She was certain of that. Men like him understood the weight of a promise made at gunpoint, especially when that gun had been held by someone who clearly knew how to use it. Still, Martha's instincts, honed by decades of survival, told her this wasn't over. It was merely the beginning of something larger. She sipped her coffee and surveyed her property with new eyes. The barn where she'd stored her past now felt exposed, vulnerable. The weapons cache that had served as insurance for 20 years might not be enough for what was coming. Her secure phone, buried in a waterproof container beneath the floorboards, hadn't been used in 8 years. But today, she might need to dig it up. The sound of an approaching engine made her freeze. Too early for the mail carrier, too quiet for another motorcycle. Martha set down her mug and moved to the living room window, keeping herself concealed behind the curtain. A black SUV with tinted windows was making its way up her drive, moving slowly, deliberately. Government plates. Martha's blood turned to ice water. She recognized the vehicle type, the cautious approach, the way it positioned itself with a clear exit route. Federal agents. The question was which agency, and more importantly, why they were here. She had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached the house. Moving with the fluid efficiency of her younger self, Martha swept through her home, gathering the items that couldn't be found. The secure phone went into her jacket pocket. A small .38 revolver slipped into her waistband. The emergency cache from behind the family photos disappeared into her boots. By the time the SUV's doors slammed shut, Martha was back on her porch, looking for all the world like a concerned elderly woman wondering about unexpected visitors. 2 agents approached, a man and woman, both in their 30s, both carrying themselves with the particular blend of confidence and wariness that screamed federal training. The woman took point while the man hung back slightly, his hand resting casually near his jacket opening. "Mrs. Chen?" The woman's voice was professionally polite, but carried an undertone of steel. "I'm Agent Sarah Collins, FBI. This is Agent David Park. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Martha's mind raced through possibilities. The bikers had been gone 2 hours, not enough time for them to contact law enforcement and for agents to respond. This had to be something else, something that had been building before last night's encounter. "Of course, dear," Martha replied, allowing a slight tremor to enter her voice. "Is everything all right? Has something happened in town?" Agent Collins studied Martha's face carefully, looking for tells, for any sign of deception. "We're investigating some unusual activity in this area. Have you noticed anything strange recently? Any unfamiliar vehicles or people on your property?" The question was a test, Martha realized. They already knew something, but how much? Her response would determine whether this remained a friendly inquiry or escalated into something more dangerous. "Well," Martha said slowly, wrapping her arms around herself as if cold, "there were some young men on motorcycles yesterday evening. They seemed lost, asking for directions to the highway. They looked rather rough, to be honest." "Is that what you mean?" Agent Park stepped forward slightly. "Did they threaten you in any way, Mrs. Chen? We have reason to believe these individuals might be dangerous." Martha's pulse quickened. The agents weren't here about her. They were tracking Marcus and his crew. But why? What had those 3 gotten themselves involved in that would draw federal attention? "Oh my," she said, pressing a hand to her chest in apparent distress. "Dangerous?" They seemed polite enough when they asked for directions. A bit intimidating perhaps, but they didn't cause any trouble. "Should I have called the police?" The 2 agents exchanged a glance. Agent Collins pulled out her phone and showed Martha a photograph. Marcus Rodriguez, taken from what looked like a surveillance camera. "Is this one of the men you saw?" Martha leaned forward, squinting at the screen with the careful attention of someone whose eyesight wasn't what it used to be. "Yes, I believe so. The one who did most of the talking. Agent Collins, you're making me quite nervous. What exactly did these men do?" But even as she asked the question, Martha was calculating distances, exit routes, and the likelihood that her barn remained uncompromised. Because whatever Marcus Rodriguez had gotten himself into, whatever had brought federal agents to her door, her carefully constructed retirement had just become infinitely more complicated. The barn door creaked as Martha stepped into the pre-dawn darkness, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She'd given Jake and his crew 12 hours to rest, clean their wounds, and prepare for what was coming. Now, as the first hints of grey touched the eastern horizon, it was time to move. Inside, she found them exactly where she'd left them. Jake sitting against a hay bale, methodically checking the rifle she'd given him, while Tommy and Bear worked on reinforcing the barn's defensive positions. They looked up as she entered, and she saw something different in their eyes. The wariness was still there, but it had shifted. They no longer looked at her like a dangerous stranger. They looked at her like soldiers waiting for orders from their commanding officer. "Report," she said simply. Jake stood, favoring his left side, where the worst of his injuries had been. "Perimeter secure. We've got good sight lines from the loft, and Tommy rigged up some early warning systems using the farm equipment. If anyone comes up the main road or tries to approach through the fields, we'll know." Martha nodded, impressed despite herself. "And your condition?" "We'll hold," Bear rumbled from where he was positioning ammunition. "Question is, will 3 beat-up bikers and 1—" He paused, searching for the right words. "1 old woman?" Martha's smile was sharp as winter steel. "I was going to say 1 badass, but sure." Bear's grin was genuine. "Will that be enough against however many Kozlov sends?" Martha moved to the workbench where she'd laid out her remaining weapons. The morning light filtering through the barn's windows caught the metal surfaces, creating deadly constellations of reflected light. "Depends on how smart they are. If they're smart, they'll send everyone. If they're not—" She shrugged. "Either way, we make them pay for every inch." Tommy, who'd been quiet since the previous evening, finally spoke up. "Why are you doing this? You could have just let us go, stayed out of it. Hell, you could have called the cops when you first found us." Martha paused in her weapons check. It was a fair question, and one she'd been asking herself since this all began. The honest answer was complicated, wrapped up in decades of guilt, retirement that had never quite felt like peace, and the simple fact that she'd looked at 3 beaten men and seen something worth protecting. "Because," she said finally, "I spent 40 years of my life eliminating problems. Now I get to save something instead." Before anyone could respond, a sharp whistle came from the loft. Tommy had rigged up a system using fishing line and empty cans, crude but effective. Someone was coming. Martha was up the ladder to the loft in seconds, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to defy both age and gravity. Through the gaps in the barn's upper walls, she could see them, 6 vehicles moving in formation up the valley road. Professional spacing, coordinated approach. Kozlov had sent his best. "How many?" Jake called from below. 6 cars, probably 4 men each, maybe more. Martha's voice was calm, analytical. "They'll try to surround the property first, cut off escape routes. Then they'll close in." She slid back down the ladder and moved to her weapons cache. The others watched as she selected items with the precision of a surgeon choosing instruments. 2 pistols went into shoulder holsters. A knife found its way to her boot. Extra magazines disappeared into hidden pockets of her jacket. "Listen carefully," she said, not looking up from her preparations. "They'll expect resistance from the barn. They'll expect you to fight like bikers. Lots of noise, wasted ammunition, emotional decisions. Don't give them what they expect." Jake stepped forward. "What's the plan?" The plan is you three hold the barn and make them think that's where I am. Draw their attention, make them commit their forces, but don't be heroes. You're the distraction, not the main event. And you? Tommy asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew. Martha finished her weapons check and looked up at them. In the growing morning light, her face seemed to have shed years. The kindly grandmother was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused, something dangerous. I'm going hunting. She moved toward the barn's back entrance, then paused. One more thing. If this goes bad, if they get past me, there's a root cellar behind the house. It connects to an old mine shaft that comes out 2 miles down the valley. Food and water for a week, plus enough cash to get you somewhere safe. Martha, Jake started. No. Her voice cut through his protest like a blade. You asked me why I'm doing this. It's because everyone deserves a chance to be something better than what they were. Don't waste it. The sound of car engines grew closer, echoing off the valley walls. Martha checked her watch. 7:23 a.m. She'd been Martha Hendricks, retired school teacher, for exactly 15 years, 3 months, and 18 days. Now, it was time to remember who she'd been before. The sound of engines grew louder as Martha finished applying the last of the field dressings to Jake's ribs. 3 motorcycles, maybe 4, approaching from the east road. She'd been expecting this since dawn broke over the mountains. They're coming back, Tommy whispered, his face pale despite the morphine she'd given him for his broken arm. Martha stood slowly, her joints protesting the movement. She walked to the kitchen window and peered through the gap in the curtains. 4 riders this time, not the original 3 who'd beaten these boys and left them for dead. These were reinforcements, and they moved with the calculated precision of men who'd done this before. Listen to me carefully, she said, turning back to the 3 bikers sprawled across her living room furniture. There's a root cellar behind the pantry. The door's hidden behind the flour sacks. You're going down there, and you're staying quiet until I come get you. We can fight, Jake said, trying to sit up straighter. Blood seeped through the bandage on his forehead. With what? Your good intentions? Martha shook her head. You can barely stand, let alone hold a weapon. This isn't your fight anymore. She helped them hobble toward the kitchen, supporting most of Tommy's weight while Diesel limped behind them, clutching his bruised ribs. The cellar door opened with a soft creak, revealing wooden steps descending into darkness. There's water down there, and some old blankets, she said. Whatever you hear up here, you stay put. Understood? The 3 men nodded, fear and gratitude mixing in their eyes as they disappeared into the shadows below. Martha replaced the flour sacks and smoothed her apron, then walked back to the living room to survey the scene. Blood-stained cushions, medical supplies scattered across the coffee table, the distinct smell of antiseptic and fear hanging in the air. The engines cut off outside. She moved quickly, gathering the medical supplies and shoving them into a drawer. The bloody cushions got flipped, clean sides up. A can of air freshener from the bathroom helped mask the scents that would give her away. 60 seconds to transform a makeshift field hospital back into a grandmother's sitting room. Heavy boots on the porch steps, the sharp rap of knuckles against wood. Martha smoothed her grey hair, took a deep breath, and opened the door with the expression of mild curiosity she'd perfected decades ago in Belgrade, in Damascus, in a dozen other places where the wrong facial expression could mean death. 4 men stood on her porch, leather-clad and dangerous. The leader was tall, with a greying beard and cold blue eyes that missed nothing. A serpent tattoo coiled around his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying just enough politeness to mask the threat underneath. "Name's Kane. We're looking for some friends of ours." "Oh my," Martha replied, injecting just the right amount of nervous flutter into her voice. "I haven't seen anyone. Is everything all right?" Kane's eyes swept past her into the house, cataloguing details. She saw him notice The spotless living room, the empty driveway, the complete absence of any sign that 3 wounded men had spent the night here. 3 boys on motorcycles, he continued. They might be hurt, looking for help. You sure you haven't seen them? Motorcycles? Martha clutched her chest with one hand. Oh, dear, no. I would have heard those awful loud engines, wouldn't I? The noise they make carries for miles out here. One of the other men, younger with prison tattoos covering his arms, stepped forward. Mind if we take a look around? Just to be sure they didn't camp out in one of your outbuildings without you knowing. I suppose that would be all right, Martha said, stepping aside. Though, I can't imagine why anyone would want to hide on my little property. There's nothing here but an old woman and her chickens. Kane nodded to his men, and they spread out across the yard, heading toward the barn and the smaller sheds scattered around the property. He remained on the porch, studying Martha with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. You live out here all alone? He asked. Oh yes, for nearly 15 years now. My Harold passed, God rest his soul, and the children all moved to the cities. Too quiet for them out here, they said. She maintained perfect eye contact, neither too bold nor too submissive. Sometimes I think they're right. Gets lonely with just the chickens for company. The men returned from their search, shaking their heads. Kane's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Well then, he said, pulling a business card from his pocket. If you do see anything, you give us a call. These boys took something that belongs to us, and we're very eager to get it back. Martha accepted the card with trembling fingers, playing the role of a frightened old woman perfectly. Of course, young man. I hope you find your friends. Kane held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw the calculation there, the weighing of possibilities. Then he stepped back, tipping his head in a mockery of courtesy. Have a blessed day, ma'am. The engines roared to life, and Martha watched them disappear down the dirt road before allowing herself to breathe normally again. The safe house sat dark against the Montana sky, its windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. Martha cut the engine of the stolen sedan 2 miles out and coasted to a stop behind a stand of lodgepole pines. The silence pressed against her eardrums like deep water. She'd memorized this place 15 years ago, a CIA waste station disguised as a hunting lodge, complete with underground bunkers and enough firepower to level a small town. If Vincent Kozlov was rebuilding his network in the States, he'd need a fortress. This would do nicely. Martha checked her watch. 3:17 a.m. Perfect timing. She'd learned long ago that the human body betrayed itself between 3 and 4, when circadian rhythms dipped lowest and even trained sentries fought to stay alert. The compound's perimeter security hadn't changed much. Motion sensors every 50 yards, infrared cameras sweeping in predictable patterns, and at least 2 roving patrols if they were following protocol. Martha smiled grimly. Some things never changed in this business, including the arrogance that made men believe their technology could replace good instincts. She moved through the forest like smoke, each step placed with surgical precision. Her body protested. 73-year-old joints weren't meant for this kind of work. But muscle memory ran deeper than age. Duck under the camera sweep. Count the seconds. Roll left. Wait for the patrol to pass. The first sentry never saw her coming. Martha materialized behind him like a shadow, one hand covering his mouth, while the other found the pressure point at the base of his skull. He dropped without a sound. She dragged him into the underbrush and relieved him of his radio and sidearm. The radio crackled softly. Sector 7, report. Martha keyed the mic, pitching her voice low and gravelly. All clear, Sector 7. Copy that. She disabled the motion sensors with techniques that predated computer systems. A handful of aluminum foil and the knowledge of where contractors always cut corners on shielding. The infrared cameras were trickier, but Martha had helped design some of these systems back in the day. She knew their blind spots like her own reflection. The safe house's main building squatted ahead, all fake rustic charm and hidden steel. Light glowed from a single window on the second floor. Martha felt her pulse quicken, not from exertion, but from the familiar electricity that preceded contact with the enemy. She approached from the building's north side, where the architect had sacrificed security for aesthetics. The decorative stonework provided handholds, and Martha began to climb. Her shoulders screamed in protest, but she pushed through the pain. This was bigger than her discomfort now. Halfway up, she heard voices drifting from the lit window. Russian. Her blood chilled as the words became clear. Confirmed the location of the other safe houses, Phoenix, Seattle, and the primary facility in Denver. The voice was cultured, educated, dangerous, excellent. And our asset in the Bureau? Feeding us intelligence in real time. They believe they're hunting us, but we're always 3 moves ahead. Martha's grip tightened on the stone. A mole in the FBI. That explained how Kozlov's people had stayed invisible for so long. She reached the window ledge and risked a glance inside. 3 men clustered around a laptop, their faces illuminated by the screen's glow. She recognized one immediately. Viktor Petrov, Kozlov's lieutenant and the architect of more assassinations than she could count. The others were new faces, but they carried themselves with the particular stillness that marked professional killers. "What about the old woman?" Petrov asked. Martha's breath caught. "Dead by now, I'd imagine." Dmitri and his team were quite explicit about their intentions. The speaker was younger, maybe 35, with the kind of bland handsomeness that made him invisible in crowds. Though I confess, she lasted longer than expected. "She was Moscow-trained," Petrov said. "Never underestimate those Cold War relics. They built them differently then." "Built us differently," the young man corrected with a smile that never reached his eyes. Martha had heard enough. She eased away from the window and continued her climb to the roof. Once there, she took stock of her situation. 3 hostiles in the room below, unknown numbers elsewhere in the building, limited ammunition, no backup coming. The smart play was to retreat, contact what remained of her old network, and call in reinforcements. But smart plays were a luxury she couldn't afford. Every minute Kozlov's people breathed was another minute they could disappear into the wind. Martha found the building's ventilation system and smiled. Some advantages never disappeared with age, like being small enough to fit through spaces designed for much younger operatives. She began unscrewing the access panel with the multi-tool from her kit. Time to remind these people why Martha Blackwood had been the agency's most feared asset for 30 years. The panel came free, with barely a whisper of sound. Martha slipped into the darkness of the ventilation shaft, moving toward the voices below like death itself seeking an appointment. The morning air carried the acrid smell of smoke and burned metal as Martha surveyed the destruction scattered across her property. 3 vehicles lay twisted and blackened, their occupants long since fled, or worse. She moved methodically through the debris, her weathered hands cataloguing evidence with the precision of someone who had done this countless times before. Tommy limped behind her, his young face pale but determined. "How many do you think got away?" "Enough to cause problems." Martha bent down, examining tire tracks in the soft earth, but not enough to feel confident about it. She straightened, her joints protesting more than they had 20 years ago, and studied the tree line beyond her fence. The attackers had come in 3 waves throughout the night, each more desperate than the last. The first had been reconnaissance, probing her defenses, testing her responses. The second had been the main assault, coordinated and brutal. The third had been revenge, sloppy and emotional. Only the third wave worried her now. "Mrs. Patterson?" Duke called from near the house, his voice carrying an urgency that made Martha's shoulders tense. "You need to see this." She found him crouched beside the porch steps, holding something that made her blood run cold. A photograph, creased and stained with mud, showed a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes. Written on the back in block letters were two words: "Your granddaughter." Martha's face remained impassive, but Tommy saw her hands clench into fists. "They know about Rebecca. Seems that way." Martha pocketed the photograph. "Which means they've been watching longer than we thought." Rico emerged from the barn, his arm in a makeshift sling but his expression alert. "Found something else. Fresh motorcycle tracks heading east toward the county road. Single rider, probably their scout." Martha nodded grimly. In her former life, she would have had resources at her disposal: safe houses, communications networks, extraction teams. Now she had 3 injured bikers, an isolated farm, and enemies who knew exactly where to find her. The satellite phone in her pocket buzzed. She'd been expecting this call. "Martha!" The voice belonged to Harrison Cole, her former handler, now buried deep within Langley's administrative maze. "We have a situation. I'm aware." She walked away from the others, lowering her voice. "How much do they know?" "Enough to be dangerous." "The Kozlov operation you shut down in Prague?" Dmitri's nephew survived. "He's been building a network, and your little display last night lit up every intelligence radar from here to Moscow." Martha closed her eyes. Prague had been her last official mission before retirement, a bloody affair involving arms dealers and human trafficking. She'd thought all loose ends had been tied off. "What's the nephew's name?" "Viktor Kozlov. 28 years old, born in Chechnya, trained in the same camps his uncle used. He's been hunting ghosts for 3 years, following rumors of the woman who destroyed his family's empire. And now he's found one. Martha, you need to disappear. Tonight. We can have a team extract you within 6 hours." She looked back at Tommy, Duke, and Rico. 3 men who had stumbled into her world through no fault of their own, who had fought beside her when they could have run. "What about the civilians?" "Not our problem." The coldness in Harrison's voice reminded her why she'd left this life behind. "They became my problem when I chose to help them. God damn it, Martha. You're 73 years old. This isn't your fight anymore." She thought about Rebecca, probably sitting in her college dorm room 300 miles away, completely unaware that her grandmother's past had finally caught up with them. "It became my fight the moment they threatened my family. Then you're on your own. I can't authorize agency resources for a retired operative's personal vendetta." The line went dead. Martha stared at the phone for a moment, then dropped it and crushed it under her heel. She'd expected no less from Harrison, but disappointment still stung. Tommy approached cautiously. "Bad news?" "The worst kind." Martha straightened her shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of command settling over her like an old coat. "We're alone in this. No backup, no cavalry, no happy endings guaranteed. So what do we do?" Martha looked at each of them in turn, injured, exhausted, but still standing, still willing to fight. "We do what we've been doing. We make them regret waking me up." She walked toward the house, her mind already calculating distances, weapons inventory, and defensive positions. Viktor Kozlov wanted to finish what his uncle had started. Let him come. She'd spent 3 years in retirement, but some skills never faded. Behind her, the 3 bikers exchanged glances. They'd followed this extraordinary woman into hell once already. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the battlefield of Martha's farm, they prepared to do it again. The explosion echoed across the valley like thunder, sending a plume of black smoke into the dawn sky. Martha watched from her position behind the ridge as flames consumed what remained of Victor's safe house. 3 more of his men wouldn't be coming after her or anyone else ever again. She shouldered her rifle and began the careful descent back toward her property. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and burning timber. Her joints protested with each step, reminding her that 73-year-old bones weren't designed for night raids and mountain climbing. but the satisfaction of watching Victor's operation crumble made every ache worthwhile. The bikers were awake when she returned to the barn, huddled around a small camp stove heating coffee. Tommy looked up as she entered, his eyes taking in her tactical gear and the weapons she carried. "Jesus, lady, what the hell did you do out there?" Martha began stripping off her gear, hanging each piece on designated hooks with practiced efficiency. "I sent a message." "That explosion," Jake started, "won't be the last one Victor hears if he's smart enough to leave." She poured herself coffee from their pot, noting how the three men watched her every movement. Fear and respect warred in their expressions. "How are you feeling?" "Like we got hit by a truck," Derek admitted, "but better than yesterday." Martha nodded, studying their faces. The swelling had gone down considerably, and their eyes were clearer. "Good, because Victor knows you're here now, and he won't wait much longer to make his move." Tommy leaned forward. "We should run, all of us. This isn't your fight." "It became my fight the moment those animals set foot on my land." Martha's voice carried steel. "And running won't solve anything. Victor's the kind of man who holds grudges. He'll hunt you to the ends of the earth if necessary." "So what do you suggest?" Jake asked. Martha smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. "We finish what he started." She moved to a cabinet they hadn't noticed before, built seamlessly into the barn's wall. Her fingers worked a complex combination lock, and the heavy door swung open to reveal an arsenal that made their earlier discoveries look like toys. Military-grade explosives, advanced surveillance equipment, communication devices that belonged in spy movies. "Martha," Derek whispered, "who the hell are you really?" She selected several items from the cabinet, her movements economical and purposeful. Someone who thought she could leave the past behind. She turned to face them. "My real name is Elena Kowalski. 25 years ago, I was one of the CIA's most effective assets in Eastern Europe. I helped bring down 3 governments and eliminated more targets than I care to remember." The silence stretched between them, heavy with revelation. "Viktor Petrov was my last assignment. I was supposed to terminate him in Prague, but the operation went sideways. My cover was blown, my team was killed, and I barely escaped with my life. The agency decided I was burned and offered me a new identity in exchange for my silence." Tommy shook his head slowly. "So you became Martha the librarian." "I became Martha the grandmother, who wanted nothing more than to tend her garden and forget the blood on her hands." She checked the magazine on a compact submachine gun. "But some ghosts refuse to stay buried." "Victor recognized you," Jake said, understanding dawning in his voice. "Eventually. Probably took him this long to track me down. He's patient when it comes to revenge." Martha strapped a tactical vest over her shirt. "Which is why we can't give him time to bring in more men or plan a proper assault." Derek struggled to his feet. "What's the plan?" "You 3 are going to stay here and recover. I'm going to end this." "Like hell," Tommy said, also standing despite his obvious pain. "We're not letting you face him alone." Martha looked at them, these 3 broken bikers who barely knew her but were willing to stand by her side. Something warm stirred in her chest, an emotion she'd thought long dead. This isn't a game. Victor isn't just some criminal. He's a professional killer with resources and training that rivals any government agency. "Then we'll need all the help we can get," Jake said simply. Martha studied their faces, seeing determination where hours before there had been only fear and confusion. Perhaps she'd underestimated them. Perhaps they were stronger than their bruises suggested. "All right," she said finally. "But we do this my way. No heroics, no improvisation. You follow my orders exactly, or people die. Understood?" They nodded in unison. Martha moved to her workbench and spread out detailed maps of the surrounding area. Red pins marked Victor's known positions, while blue lines indicated possible approach routes. She'd been planning this confrontation for hours, running scenarios and calculating odds. Victor's holed up in the old Morrison Ranch, 5 miles south. He's got at least 8 men with him, possibly more arriving throughout the day. She looked up at her unlikely allies. We hit them at sunset. The safe house sat nestled in a grove of evergreens 30 miles north of Martha's property, its weathered cabin exterior hiding sophisticated surveillance equipment and reinforced walls. Marcus had acquired it years ago through a network of contacts who specialized in providing sanctuary for those who lived in the shadows between legal and necessary. Martha checked the perimeter sensors from the kitchen window while coffee brewed. 3 days had passed since the confrontation at her farm, and the bikers were healing faster than expected. Jake could walk without assistance now, though he still favored his left side. Tommy's face had progressed from purple to an unpleasant yellow-green, and his broken ribs were mending under Martha's careful attention. "You don't have to do this," Diesel said from the doorway, his voice still rough from the damage to his throat. Martha didn't turn around. She'd heard him approach. His footsteps had lost their earlier stealth as trust gradually replaced wariness. "Do what? Take care of us. We're not your responsibility." She poured coffee into 2 mugs, added cream to hers, and handed him the black one. "Maybe not. But here we are." Diesel accepted the coffee, studying her face. Over the past 3 days, he'd watched her clean wounds with steady hands, cook meals that somehow tasted like comfort, and maintain their security with the casual efficiency of someone accustomed to life-or-death situations. The contradictions in Martha Flynn had stopped surprising him and started making a different kind of sense. "Marcus filled us in," he said, "about who you used to be. Did he now?" Martha's tone carried a warning. "Enough. We know you weren't always a farmer." Through the window, Martha watched Marcus emerge from the tree line, returning from his morning reconnaissance. His movements carried the same careful alertness she remembered from their operational days, when trust was earned in blood and measured in heartbeats. "The past has a way of finding us," she said finally, "no matter how far we run or how quiet we try to live." "Is that what you were doing? Running?" Martha sipped her coffee, considering the question. "I was trying to become someone else. Someone who grew tomatoes and worried about weather instead of body counts. But you couldn't leave it behind. You never leave it behind. You just bury it deeper and hope it stays buried." She turned to face him. "What about you? What were you running from when you ended up on my property?" Diesel's laugh held no humor. Bad choices, worse consequences. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "We were moving some cargo for people we shouldn't have trusted. Turns out they needed us dead more than they needed us loyal. And the cargo? Gone. Along with any proof of what they hired us to transport." His jaw tightened. "They used us to move something that could destroy them, then tried to eliminate the witnesses." Martha absorbed this information, fitting it into the larger picture that had been taking shape since Marcus's arrival. What kind of cargo requires that level of cleanup? Before Diesel could answer, Marcus entered through the back door, his expression grim. "We have movement on the access road, 2 vehicles moving slow and careful." Martha set down her coffee and moved to the weapons cabinet concealed behind a false panel. "How far out?" 10 minutes, maybe less. She pulled out a compact assault rifle and checked the magazine with practiced efficiency. "Jake and Tommy? Tommy's mobile enough to move. Jake's going to need help." Diesel was already heading toward the bedrooms. "I'll get them ready." Martha caught his arm. "Can they fight?" "If they have to. They'll have to." The next few minutes blurred together in the familiar rhythm of tactical preparation. Martha activated the cabin's defensive systems, motion sensors, cameras, and carefully placed charges that could deny access without bringing down the entire structure. Marcus took position at the front windows, while Diesel helped Jake and Tommy to a reinforced interior room that offered both protection and firing positions. Through the surveillance monitors, Martha watched 2 black SUVs approach with military precision. The vehicles stopped just outside the property line, disgorging 8 men in tactical gear who moved with the coordination of a professional team. Military contractors, Marcus observed, studying their approach pattern through binoculars. Corporate security, not government. Which means they're here for the bikers, not us, Martha said. Unless those two things are connected now. Martha considered this as she watched the assault team spread out to surround the cabin. Her quiet retirement had ended the moment she chose to help 3 beaten strangers instead of turning away. Some lines, once crossed, changed everything that followed. "Diesel," she called out. "That cargo you mentioned, what exactly were you moving?" His voice carried back from the other room, tight with resignation. "Financial records. Digital files that could expose money laundering operations for half the criminal organizations on the West Coast." Martha and Marcus exchanged glances. The stakes had just climbed considerably higher. "And these people," Martha continued, "they'd rather start a war than let those files surface? They'd rather eliminate anyone who knows the files existed." Outside, the assault team had completed their positioning. Martha counted muzzle flashes through the trees and knew their time for questions had run out. The GPS tracker blinked steadily on Martha's phone screen as she crouched behind a massive oak tree, watching the compound through military-grade binoculars. 3 hours of reconnaissance had revealed the layout, a main house, 2 outbuildings, and a garage where they'd likely taken Tommy and his friends. 6 guards patrolled in rotating shifts, armed but sloppy. These weren't professionals, just thugs with guns. She'd counted 12 motorcycles in the lot. The Crimson Wolves were home. Martha checked her watch. 3:47 a.m. The changing of the guard happened every 2 hours, and she'd timed the gap. 43 seconds when the south perimeter went unwatched. More than enough. She moved like smoke through the darkness, her 73-year-old body remembering every lesson from decades past. The compound's security was laughable compared to the Eastern European facilities she'd infiltrated in her prime. These men had grown comfortable, arrogant in their remote mountain stronghold. The first guard never saw her coming. Martha's garrote wire was around his throat before he could draw breath to shout. She lowered his unconscious body behind a woodpile and continued toward the garage, where muffled sounds suggested her boys were still alive. Through a grimy window, she glimpsed Tommy tied to a chair, his face bloody but defiant. Jake and Marcus flanked him, both conscious but beaten. 3 wolves stood around them, one holding a crowbar like a question mark. "Last chance, kid," the crowbar wielder growled. "Where's the old lady hiding?" Tommy spat blood. "Go to hell." Martha smiled grimly. The boy had spine. She circled to the garage's rear entrance, testing the door handle. Locked, but the wood frame was old and warped. She slipped a thin blade between the door and jamb, working the simple latch until it clicked open. The first wolf was lighting a cigarette when Martha's knife found the space between his ribs. She guided him down silently, already moving toward the second man before the body hit the concrete. Her suppressed Glock whispered twice, "Center mass, clean kills." The third wolf spun toward the sound, fumbling for his weapon. Martha was already there, her hand clamping over his mouth as her blade found his kidney. He dropped without a sound. "Jesus Christ," Jake breathed as Martha cut their bonds. "You're like some kind of—" "Save it," Martha whispered, checking Tommy's injuries. Bruised ribs, split lip, but nothing life-threatening. "Can you boys move?" Tommy nodded, working feeling back into his hands. "There's more of them, maybe 10 in the main house." "I counted 12 total," Martha said, passing Jake a pistol from one of the dead wolves. 3 down, 9 to go. Marcus stared at the bodies. "You killed them, just like that." Martha's eyes were flint. They forfeited their lives when they touched what's mine. Now we need to move before... The garage lights blazed on. A voice called from outside. "Rodriguez? Everything okay in there?" "Rodriguez, answer me, damn it." The door swung open, Martha let the first man clear the threshold before breaking his neck with a precise twist. The second wolf managed half a shout before her knife silenced him permanently. The third tried to run, but Jake's borrowed pistol barked once, dropping him in the doorway. "Nice shot," Martha murmured. Shouts erupted from the main house. Lights flickered on across the compound. "So much for stealth," Tommy said, checking the magazine on a confiscated rifle. Martha was already moving toward their escape route when engines roared to life outside. Headlights swept across the garage windows as motorcycles circled the building. "Back exits compromised," she reported, peering through the rear window. "3 bikes, riders armed." "We're trapped," Marcus said. Martha's smile was predatory. "No, son, they are." She grabbed a jerrycan of gasoline from the workbench and began splashing it across the garage floor, creating a trail toward the front entrance. The boys watched in fascination as she rigged an improvised incendiary device from shop rags and a road flare. "When I light this, we go out the back fast and low," she instructed. "There's a drainage ditch 50 yards north. Reach it and follow it downhill to the tree line." "What about you?" Tommy asked. Martha hefted her rifle. "I'll be right behind you." She struck the flare, tossed it onto the gasoline trail, and kicked open the rear door as flames roared to life behind them. The boys bolted for the ditch while Martha provided covering fire, her shots precise and devastating. 2 riders went down before the others realized their garage was becoming an inferno. In the chaos of smoke and flames, Martha reached the ditch where her boys waited. "Now we hunt," she said, chambering a fresh round. The Crimson Wolves had started this war. But they'd forgotten they were dealing with someone who'd perfected the art of finishing them. The warehouse district stretched before them like a concrete graveyard, shadows pooling between buildings that had been abandoned to rust and decay. Martha adjusted her grip on the Glock, feeling the familiar weight settle into her palm as she studied the approaching complex through the binoculars. Dimitri's intel had been solid. 3 black SUVs sat parked outside the main building, and she could count at least 6 guards patrolling the perimeter. "There," Jake whispered, pointing to a second-story window where movement flickered behind grimy glass. "That's got to be where they're holding them." Martha lowered the binoculars and checked her watch. 3:17 in the morning, the witching hour, when exhaustion made even trained men sloppy. She'd counted on that advantage more times than she cared to remember, back when counting meant the difference between completing a mission and never seeing home again. "We go in quiet," she murmured, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect in rooms full of men who killed for governments. "Jake, you take the south entrance. Create a distraction at exactly 3:30. Tommy, you're with me on the north side." Tommy shifted nervously beside her, the shotgun trembling slightly in his hands. "Martha, what if—" "No what-ifs." Her steel-grey eyes fixed on his. "You follow my lead, do exactly what I say, and we all walk out of this alive, including your brothers." She moved like smoke across the open ground, decades of muscle memory guiding each step. The first guard never saw her coming. One moment he was lighting a cigarette, the next he was unconscious on the gravel, Martha's arm releasing from around his throat. She caught his radio before it hit the ground, sliding it into her jacket pocket. Tommy watched in stunned silence as she systematically disabled the exterior security. This wasn't the woman who baked him cookies and asked about his mother's arthritis. This was someone else entirely, someone who moved through the darkness like she owned it. The explosion from the south side came precisely on schedule, Jake's improvised distraction sending orange flames licking up the side of an abandoned van. Shouts erupted from inside the building as guards rushed toward the commotion, leaving their posts exactly as Martha had predicted they would. "Now," she breathed, and they slipped through the north entrance like ghosts. The interior reeked of motor oil and something else, fear, sharp and metallic in the stale air. Martha's enhanced hearing picked up voices from above, Russian accents barking orders. She counted footsteps, memorized the building's acoustics, calculated angles of attack with the cold precision that had once made her one of the agency's most valuable assets. They climbed the stairs in silence, Martha's hand signals guiding Tommy through movements he'd never learned but somehow understood. At the top, she held up her fist and he froze, watching as she peered around the corner. 3 men stood guard outside a reinforced door. Through the crack beneath it, she could see shadows, Bear and Crash, bound but alive. Her jaw tightened. One of the Russians was speaking into a phone, his words carrying clearly in the empty hallway. "Da, we have them. The old woman won't be a problem much longer." Martha smiled, and Tommy felt his blood chill at the expression. It wasn't grandmotherly warmth. It was the smile of a predator that had just located its prey. She moved with lethal efficiency. The first guard went down with a pressure point strike that dropped him silently to the concrete. The second spun toward the sound, his weapon half drawn when Martha's elbow connected with his temple. The third man, the one with the phone, had just enough time to register what was happening before her Glock pressed against his forehead. "Hang up," she said quietly. Her voice carried the kind of calm that spoke of absolute certainty, the tone of someone who had delivered final ultimatums in a dozen different languages. The phone clattered to the floor. "Keys," she continued, never moving the gun barrel from its position. Slowly, he fumbled for the ring at his belt, hands shaking as he held it out. Martha nodded to Tommy, who grabbed the keys and rushed to the door. It swung open to reveal Bear and Crash, bloodied but conscious, their eyes widening as they took in the scene. "Holy shit, Martha," Bear whispered. "What the hell?" Explanations later, she cut him off, still holding the Russian at gunpoint. "Can you both walk?" They nodded, struggling to their feet as Tommy cut their bonds. Martha reached into the guard's jacket and pulled out his radio, keeping her weapon trained on him as she keyed the mic. "This is the old woman," she said into the device, her voice carrying to every guard in the building. "I'm giving you one chance to leave. Walk away now and live to see tomorrow. Stay and join your friends who thought they could threaten my family." The building fell silent except for the distant crackle of Jake's fire still burning outside. The safe house sat in pre-dawn darkness, its windows black against the forest backdrop. Martha crouched behind a fallen log 50 yards out, studying the building through night vision binoculars she'd retrieved from her go-bag. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter in lazy patterns, automatic weapons slung casually across their shoulders. Amateurs. She'd been watching for an hour, mapping their routes, counting their steps, noting how the one on the east side favored his left leg and the other couldn't resist checking his phone every few minutes. Sloppy discipline that would cost them. The tracker she'd pulled from Tommy's jacket had led her here, to this converted hunting lodge tucked deep in the Cascade foothills. Dimitri's insurance policy, no doubt, a place to hold assets until they could be properly disposed of. The thought of Jake and the others trapped inside sent cold fury through her veins. Martha checked her watch. 4:30 a.m. The guards would be at their most vulnerable now, fatigue wearing down whatever alertness they'd started with. She pulled the suppressed Sig Sauer from her shoulder holster and began her approach. The eastern guard went down first, a whispered dart of metal through darkness, before he could react to the shadow that materialized behind him. Martha caught his body, easing it to the ground behind a woodpile. His partner wouldn't complete his circuit for another 3 minutes. She moved like smoke through the trees, decades of muscle memory guiding her steps around every twig and loose stone. The second guard died without ever knowing danger had found him, slumping against the building's corner where she arranged him to look like he was resting. The front door was locked, but locks had never been much of an obstacle. Her picks made quick work of the mechanism, and she slipped inside to find herself in a rustic great room dominated by a massive stone fireplace. hunting trophies, stared down from the walls with glassy eyes. Voices drifted from somewhere deeper in the building. She followed the sound down a hallway lined with bedroom doors, testing each one quietly. Empty, empty. The third door was locked from the outside, a promising sign. Martha pressed her ear to the wood and heard the soft rasp of controlled breathing. Someone awake and trying to stay quiet. She worked the lock with surgical precision, then eased the door open just wide enough to peer inside. Jake sat propped against the far wall, his face a patchwork of bruises, but his eyes alert. When he saw her, relief flickered across his features before settling into grim determination. She pressed a finger to her lips and slipped into the room. "Tommy? Rico?" she whispered. "Next room over," Jake breathed. "3 guards downstairs. They've been taking turns coming up to ask questions." She cut his zip-tie restraints with a tactical knife. "Can you move?" He flexed his hands, wincing. "Yeah, they worked me over pretty good, but nothing's broken." The door to the adjacent room opened just as easily. Tommy and Rico were in worse shape. Tommy unconscious with what looked like a serious head wound, Rico awake but barely. Martha's jaw tightened as she freed them. "Rico, can you carry Tommy?" she asked. He nodded shakily. "I think so." Footsteps echoed from the stairwell, heavy boots climbing toward them. Martha motioned for the others to stay back and positioned herself beside the hallway entrance, knife ready. The guard rounded the corner, checking his phone, completely unprepared for the blade that opened his throat in one swift motion. She caught him as he fell, lowering him silently to the floor. "Move," she whispered. They made their way toward the stairs, Rico supporting Tommy's dead weight while Jake stayed close behind Martha. The great room below was dimly lit by a single lamp, throwing long shadows across the space. 2 more guards sat at a card table near the kitchen, playing poker and sharing a bottle of vodka. Stupid and drunk, even better than tired. Martha signaled for the others to wait, then descended the stairs like a ghost. The first guard died with cards still in his hand, Martha's knife punching up through the base of his skull. His partner had just enough time to register his friend's sudden stillness before steel found his heart. She waved the others down, and they made their way toward the door. Tommy was starting to come around, mumbling incoherently as Rico half-carried him across the room. They were almost to the exit when headlights swept across the windows. A vehicle was coming up the access road, moving fast. "Back door," Martha hissed, changing direction, but as they reached the kitchen, more lights appeared through the rear windows. They were surrounded. Martha's mind raced through options, calculating angles and odds. The approaching vehicles meant reinforcements, too many to fight through with 3 wounded men in tow. She spotted a door she'd missed before, partially hidden behind the refrigerator. When she pulled it open, wooden steps led down into darkness. "Basement," she said. "Now." They descended into the musty space below, just as engines cut off outside and car doors began slamming. Voices shouted in Russian, angry and urgent. Someone upstairs had discovered the bodies. The warehouse smelled of rust and motor oil, its concrete floor stained with decades of automotive fluids. Martha crouched behind a stack of tires, watching Viktor Kozlov pace between his remaining men like a caged predator. The Russian crime boss had aged since their last encounter 15 years ago, his hair silver now, deep lines etched around his pale eyes. But the cold intelligence remained unchanged. "She killed Dmitri and Pavel like they were children," Kozlov said, his accent thick with anger. "This grandmother, this phantom from our past." He stopped pacing and turned to face his 6 remaining soldiers. "But phantoms can bleed. Phantoms can die." Martha counted the exits. Main entrance blocked by 2 guards, loading dock on the east wall covered by another, fire escape on the second level unwatched, but requiring her to cross 30 feet of open floor. The bikers, Tommy, Jake, and Sean, hung suspended from chains in the center of the space, barely conscious but alive. That was all that mattered. She'd tracked Kozlov's crew here, using methods that felt both foreign and familiar after 2 decades of retirement. The old instincts had awakened like muscle memory, reading tire tracks, following diesel exhaust, intercepting radio chatter, skills she'd hoped never to use again, but skills that never truly died. The loading dock guard lit a cigarette, his attention drifting to his phone. Martha moved. She covered the distance in seconds, her knife finding the soft spot beneath his jaw before he could cry out. The cigarette fell, still burning, as she lowered his body behind a shipping container. 20 feet away, Kozlov continued his monologue about American interference and old debts. "You cost me everything in Prague," he said to the darkness, as if sensing her presence. "My operation, my reputation, my brother's life. I spent 15 years tracking you, only to discover Martha Henley had become Martha Sullivan, living like a peasant on some worthless farm." Martha slipped between the shadows, working her way closer. The bikers had become pawns in a game that predated their birth, caught in the crossfire of choices she'd made when their parents were still children. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like an old coat. "But you made a mistake," Kozlov continued. "You forgot that wolves hunt in packs, and patience is our greatest weapon." A floorboard creaked 20 feet to her left. Martha froze, then smiled grimly. Kozlov had positioned more men than she'd initially counted, professionals who'd been waiting in concealment. The warehouse was a trap, and she'd walked directly into it. "There she is," Kozlov called out, as a spotlight blazed to life, pinning Martha in harsh white light. The legendary Black Sparrow, reduced to protecting motorcycle trash on a dirt road. Martha raised her hands slowly, her mind already calculating angles and distances. 3 red laser dots danced across her chest from different directions, professional positioning, overlapping fields of fire. Kozlov had learned from their previous encounters. "Drop your weapons," the crime boss ordered. She let her knife clatter to the concrete, followed by the pistol she'd taken from Dmitri, but they hadn't searched her thoroughly enough, never did, when facing a 73-year-old woman. The ceramic blade taped to her inner thigh remained undetected, along with the flashbang grenade hidden in the lining of her jacket. 20 years ago, you killed my brother Alexei in that Prague warehouse," Kozlov said, walking closer. "You burned down everything I'd built, sent me running like a common criminal." "Alexei was trafficking children," Martha replied, her voice steady. "Some things can't be ignored." "Justice?" Kozlov laughed. "You were CIA Black Ops, not a social worker. You had no authority in Czech Republic, no jurisdiction. You were a killer who decided to play God." The truth stung because it held fragments of accuracy. Martha had exceeded her orders in Prague, had allowed personal conviction to override professional restraint. But watching those terrified children being loaded into shipping containers had shattered something inside her, something that demanded action regardless of consequences. "These boys have nothing to do with Prague," she said, nodding toward the suspended bikers. "No, but they have everything to do with you." Kozlov drew a chrome-plated pistol. "You care about them, which makes them valuable. Pain shared is pain doubled, yes?" Tommy raised his head, blood streaming from his nose. His eyes found Martha's across the warehouse floor, and she saw the same stubborn courage that had made him stand up to Kozlov's men on the road. The same foolish bravery that reminded her why some fights were worth taking. Martha Sullivan, grandmother and retired horse trainer, would have negotiated, would have tried to trade herself for their safety. But Black Sparrow had never been particularly good at surrender. The flashbang came free with a subtle movement, her thumb finding the pin. Kozlov was still talking when she smiled. "Some phantoms," she said, "bite back." The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmhouse porch as Martha sat in her rocking chair, cradling a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. 3 days had passed since the warehouse, and the silence felt different now. Not the oppressive quiet of being hunted, but the peaceful stillness of a storm finally past. Jake emerged from the guest bedroom, moving carefully but under his own power. His ribs were still wrapped, and purple bruises painted half his face, but his eyes held clarity they'd lacked since she'd first found him bleeding in her driveway. "How you feeling, son?" Martha asked, without looking up from her coffee. "Like I got hit by a freight train, but I'll live." He settled into the chair beside her with a grunt. "Thanks to you, you would have done the same." Jake studied her profile, noting the way she held herself. Relaxed but alert, like a soldier who'd finally made it home but couldn't quite forget the war. "Would I? I'm not so sure I had that kind of courage in me before all this." Martha finally turned to meet his gaze. "Courage isn't something you have or don't have. It's something you choose, moment by moment. You chose it when you came back for Tommy and Bear. You chose it when you stood with me against Volkov." "Speaking of Tommy and Bear," Jake said, gesturing toward the driveway where 2 familiar motorcycles were parked. "They're planning to head out today." As if summoned by their conversation, Tommy and Bear rounded the corner of the house, both moving with the stiff gait of men still healing. Tommy carried a small duffel bag, while Bear held a manila envelope in his massive hands. "Morning, Martha," Tommy said, his voice carrying a respect that would have been unthinkable a week ago. "Wanted to say goodbye, proper-like." Bear stepped forward, extending the envelope. "This is for you. Everything we could gather about the Devil's Crossroads, bank accounts, safe houses, contacts. Figured you might want to make sure none of them get ideas about continuing Volkov's work." Martha accepted the envelope, feeling its weight. Even in retirement, it seemed, her work wasn't quite finished. "You boys sure you don't want to stick around? Place gets lonely." "Appreciate it," Tommy said, "but we got our own ghosts to outrun. Heard there's work in Montana for men willing to start fresh." "Good work," Bear added. "Construction, maybe security. Something honest." Martha nodded, understanding. Some people healed by staying still, others by moving forward. These men needed the road beneath their wheels and the horizon ahead of them. Jake stood, extending his hand to each of them. "Take care of yourselves out there." "You too, brother," Tommy said, gripping Jake's hand firmly. "You ever decide the quiet life ain't for you, look us up." Bear surprised them all by pulling Martha into a gentle bear hug. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." They watched from the porch as the 2 bikers mounted their machines, the rumble of Harley engines disturbing the morning peace. Tommy raised a hand in farewell, and then they were gone, disappearing down the long gravel drive in a cloud of dust and engine noise. "Think they'll make it?" Jake asked. "They will," Martha said with certainty. "They've got something worth living for now, each other, and the chance to be better than they were." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What about us? What happens now?" Martha rocked gently, considering. "Well, I suppose that depends on what you want to happen. You've got a life back in the city, I imagine. Job, friends, responsibilities." "Had," Jake corrected. "Past tense. Funny how a week of running for your life puts things in perspective. Turns out most of what I thought mattered really didn't. And what does matter?" Jake gestured at the peaceful farmland stretching to the horizon, at the neat vegetable garden where Martha had been teaching him to tell weeds from seedlings, at the barn where she'd shown him how to properly maintain a motorcycle engine. This, the quiet, the work. Having someone to share it with who understands that sometimes the past follows you home. Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of a future she actually wanted to live. "Place needs work," she said carefully. "Roof's got some loose shingles, fence needs mending, and I'm not getting any younger. Good thing I'm unemployed and looking for honest work." "It won't always be peaceful," Martha warned. "Men like Volkov, sometimes they have friends, partners, people who come looking for answers or revenge." Jake met her eyes steadily. "Then I guess it's good I know someone who can handle that kind of trouble." Martha smiled, the first truly peaceful expression that had crossed her face in decades. "I suppose it is." The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, and for the first time in 30 years, Martha allowed herself to believe that the war might finally be over.